The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above the St. Catherine's emergency department as the digital clock shifted to 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night that would change everything. It was the kind of night where the moon hung low and bruised over the city, and the ER was beginning to fill with the remnants of what most people would consider a normal evening. Drunk college kids with twisted ankles, elderly patients with chest pains that turned out to be indigestion, a mother with a feverish toddler who'd been waiting for 3 hours. The kind of night that made time feel like it moved differently. One moment you're beginning your shift, and the next, you're running on your 4th cup of cold coffee, wondering if you'll make it through without falling apart or screaming into the void of the supply closet. Sarah Chen had been a registered nurse for 7 years, but on this particular night, she felt like she was drowning in ways that had nothing to do with the volume of patients or the complexity of the cases. Not because of the patients themselves. She could handle patients just fine. She'd handled them for 7 years. Her hands were usually steady, her mind quick. Her reassurances genuine, and not just the automatic platitudes of someone going through the motions. What made her feel like she was drowning? What made her want to retreat into the bathroom and just sit on the closed toilet lid for 5 minutes with her eyes shut? Was the new residents rotating through the ER. Specifically, one of them, Dr. Brandon McKenzie, who had the kind of confidence that came from never having his competence questioned, from a childhood of privilege and educational excellence that had been assured from the moment he was born into the right family, and from the type of arrogance that only a Harvard-trained doctor fresh out of residency could possibly muster with such ease. Sarah's hands had started shaking around 9 p.m., right about the time Dr. McKenzie had made a snide comment about her nervous energy while she was preparing medication for a patient in the trauma bay. She'd heard him say it to the traveling medical student who was rotating through for the month, a comment made just loud enough that she was clearly meant to hear it, designed to be the kind of observation that would make her feel small and incompetent, without him having to directly confront her about anything. She'd held her breath and counted to 10. Then she'd held it again, this time all the way to 20. Now, as she moved through the hallway with a cart of supplies, her fingers trembled with that peculiar vibration that she'd learned to recognize years ago. The physical manifestation of memories trying to claw their way to the surface, demanding attention, insisting on being acknowledged, even when she'd spent months trying to pretend they didn't exist. The tremors in her hands were subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice them, but in a hospital environment, where observation was literally part of the job description, they were impossible to hide completely. Sarah found herself becoming hyper-aware of her own body, of every slight shake, every moment when her fingers didn't move with the precision and confidence she was known for. She started tucking her hands into her pockets when she wasn't actively using them. She started volunteering for tasks that required more stability, thinking that if she just proved herself capable enough, if she just demonstrated her competence clearly enough, maybe the tremors would stop, but they didn't stop. Because the tremors weren't really about her competence at all. Though she didn't fully understand that yet. The shift had been relatively quiet until the radio call came through at 11:53 p.m., just as Sarah was finishing up some documentation in the break room, with a cup of terrible coffee that had been sitting in the pot for at least 3 hours. A multi-vehicle accident on Interstate 95, one of the main highways that cut through the city. Multiple trauma victims. The dispatcher reported with that particular tone that meant things were serious. All heading to St. Catherine's. Estimated arrival in 10 minutes. Everyone in the ER suddenly moved like they'd been hit with an electric current, with that coordinated sense of purposeful urgency that came from years of training and muscle memory and the deep, bone-level knowledge that the next few hours would determine whether people lived or died, whether families would receive phone calls with bad news or relieved gratitude. Sarah found herself in the main trauma bay as they wheeled in the first victim, a 42-year-old man with crush, injuries to his lower extremities and a femur, fracture that was bleeding profusely, the kind of injury that required immediate intervention if there was going to be any chance of saving the limb, let alone the man's life. Dr. McKenzie was already there, barking orders with the kind of confidence that came from his credentials, and Sarah moved into position with practiced ease that came from years of doing this, from the muscle memory that her body possessed even when her mind wanted to retreat. She was hanging an IV, her fingers working through the motions despite the shaking, finding the vein with the kind of intuitive precision that only came from thousands of repetitions. Blood was everywhere, on the patient's clothes, on the floor, painting a picture of a body in crisis. Another ambulance arrived, sirens wailing their urgent song. Someone else came crashing through the doors. A woman, late 30s, with head trauma that made her face unrecognizable and a fractured collarbone that had punctured her shoulder. The trauma was visible in the way she gasped for breath, in the confused look in her eyes that suggested her brain was struggling to process what had happened to her body. Then a teenager with a pneumothorax, a collapsed lung, who was going into shock as they wheeled him in. Then another adult. A child, actually, maybe 9 or 10 years old, with injuries that made Sarah's heart clench in a way that was both professional and deeply, painfully personal. The bay became a choreography of controlled chaos. Machines beeping their urgent warnings. Doctors shouting orders that needed to be executed immediately. Nurses moving with the precision of dancers who'd practiced their performance 1,000 times in their minds, even if they'd only actually done it a handful of times in reality. There was blood and sweat, and the particular smell of fear mixed with antiseptic. There was the sound of equipment being assembled, of medications being drawn up, of people calling out vital signs and updates and requests for additional resources. Sarah was competent in this environment. She was good at this. This was where she felt most like herself, most like the person she'd been trained to be, until it wasn't anymore. It was during the third patient that Sarah noticed her hands were shaking so badly that a traveling medical student, some kid who couldn't have been more than 25 years old, with the kind of energy that came from being fresh out of medical school and still believing the world was mostly logical and predictable, actually pointed it out. He was assisting Dr. McKenzie with suturing a laceration on the woman with head trauma, and he glanced over at Sarah as she was trying to establish a central line on the teenager with the collapsed lung. A central line is not a simple procedure. It requires finding the exact location of the internal jugular vein or the subclavian vein, advancing a needle and wire through the skin and into the vessel, and threading a catheter through without damaging any of the surrounding structures. It's the kind of procedure that requires steady hands and a calm mind. "You okay?" the traveling student asked, the question carrying the weight of unspoken judgment. The kind of observation that wasn't really a question at all, but rather an accusation disguised as concern. "You seem anxious." The word hung in the air like smoke. Anxious, not steady, not confident, not competent. Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't respond. She was concentrating too hard on the needle, on the ultrasound image on the screen that showed the vein in cross-section, on the anatomical landmarks she'd memorized years ago, on breathing through the tightness in her chest that had suddenly appeared. But her hands betrayed her. They shook. The needle wavered. For just a moment, 1 moment, 1 second. She lost her focus, and the world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. The traveling student exchanged a look with Dr. McKenzie, and Sarah saw something flash across the chief resident's face. Skepticism? Concern? Disdain? The kind of look that suggested questions about her capabilities, about her professionalism, about whether she had any business being in this trauma bay at all. She couldn't quite tell exactly what was going through his mind, but she could read the general message: doubt. "Maybe you need to step back," Dr. McKenzie said, his voice carrying that particular tone of false concern that landed like an insult, the kind of suggestion that sounded like it was coming from a place of caring, but actually came from a place of judgment. "I don't want to question your competency on a critical patient, but if you're not feeling stable..." "I've got this," Sarah said quietly, and then she proved it. Her hand steadied. The shaking stopped, or at least reduced enough that it was no longer noticeable. The needle found the vein smoothly, perfectly placed on the first try, and the teenager's oxygen saturation improved almost immediately as the air that had been compressing his lung was released, and his breathing became easier. It was textbook perfect. It was exactly what needed to happen. Exactly when it needed to happen. Exactly the way it needed to happen. But the damage had been done. The seed of doubt had been planted in the room like a noxious weed, and Sarah could feel it growing, spreading, taking root in the consciousness of everyone who had heard that exchange. She could feel the weight of their attention on her hands, monitoring them for tremors, waiting for her to fail, expecting that she would eventually prove Dr. McKenzie's unspoken concerns to be justified. It was a sensation she hadn't felt in 6 years. Not since she'd left the army. Not since the last time her hands had shaken like this. In a place where shaking hands could cost lives. Where one moment of lost focus could mean the difference between someone going home to their family or not going anywhere ever again. A fellow trauma nurse, Patricia Coleman, a woman in her late 40s who'd been working at St. Catherine's for 15 years and had seen everything, stepped in to help with the teenager. Her eyes met Sarah's for just a moment, and Sarah saw understanding there, not judgment, but compassion. Patricia had been a trauma surgeon's wife for 20 years before the divorce. She knew what it looked like when someone was carrying something heavy. She knew what it looked like when the mind was fighting against the body's instinctive responses. Sarah was reassigned to the first trauma victim, the man with the crush injuries, and she threw herself into the work with the kind of intensity that came from needing to prove something. From needing to demonstrate that she was still competent, still capable, still worthy of the trust that had been placed in her when she'd been hired at this hospital. But the air around her had changed. She could feel the eyes on her hands, monitoring them for tremors, waiting for her to fail. She could feel the weight of implicit judgment, the way that one moment of uncertainty had cast a shadow over everything else that she would do for the rest of the night, a night blurred into a sequence of moments that felt both eternal and like they were happening at warp speed. 3 hours of constant activity. 4, 5. The multi-vehicle accident had resulted in 11 victims total, and St. Catherine's handled 8 of them. The other 3 were transferred to Regional Medical Center, which had additional trauma capacity. By the time the chaos began to settle into the controlled emergency of ongoing ICU admissions and post-operative monitoring, by the time the adrenaline started to wear off and reality began to reassert itself, Sarah was running on fumes. She'd managed to stay professional, to keep doing her job, to perform every task with precision and care. but she could feel the weight of the whispers that had started around 11:30 p.m. She could see the knowing looks that passed between the other medical professionals. She could feel the traveling student's lingering gaze as he stood by the nursing station, talking to Dr. McKenzie and pointing in her direction with his chin, discussing her in those low tones that made it clear they thought she couldn't hear them. She could see the way Dr. McKenzie's jaw tightened when he looked at her now. A look that suggested responsibility, concern, maybe even a hint of doubt about her capability to continue working in the trauma bay for the rest of the night. The clock on the wall read 4:17 a.m. when Dr. McKenzie approached her at the med station. The rest of the night shift was quieter now, with patients being transferred to ICU and the immediate crisis past, with the hospital settling back into its normal rhythm of monitored emergencies and ongoing recovery. Sarah was documenting one of the critical cases when he walked up, and she felt her stomach drop. This was it. This was the moment she'd been dreading since 11:53 p.m. This was when he was going to ask her to take an extended break. Or worse, tell her that her services might not be needed for the rest of the shift. This was when her competence was going to be officially questioned, when her career at St. Catherine's was going to be put in jeopardy because of one moment of trembling hands in a crisis situation. "Nurse Chen," he said, and his voice had changed from the tone he'd used earlier. There was something different in it now. Something uncertain. Something that didn't quite fit with the arrogance that had characterized his entire presence in the trauma bay. "I need to talk to you, privately." Sarah followed him into the small break room, where the ancient coffee maker gurgled its last breath into an empty pot, and the walls were painted that institutional shade of pale yellow that no one had chosen and everyone had learned to ignore. The break room was empty at this hour, just the two of them and the fluorescent lights that cast everything in a particularly unflattering way. Dr. McKenzie closed the door, and Sarah prepared herself for what was coming. She'd been through performance reviews before. She'd been questioned about her capabilities before, though not in a long time. She could handle this. She'd handled worse. But then he didn't say what she expected. Instead of launching into a speech about concerns or suggesting that she take some time off or recommending that she speak with the Employee Assistance Program, he reached out and gently took her wrist, the left one, the one that had been trembling most noticeably throughout the night, the one she'd been trying so hard to control. "You were rolling up your sleeves," he said, his voice quiet now, stripped of the arrogance that had been there before. "Just now, I saw it when you were washing your hands. The edge of something. A tattoo, I think. Could you show me?" Sarah froze completely. Her entire body went rigid, like someone had suddenly turned her into stone. There were very few tattoos she bothered to hide at work. Very few marks on her body that she felt the need to conceal. Most of the nurses had visible tattoos. Flowers, quotes, the names of family members, symbols with personal meaning. But this one she always covered up at work, always made sure was hidden under her scrubs or under long sleeves, even in summer when the hospital was kept at a temperature that made most people want to roll up their sleeves for relief. It wasn't one of the delicate flowers or meaningful quotes that other nurses had inked on their bodies. It wasn't a symbol of love or loss or spiritual belief. This was a combat patch, the distinctive emblem of a military police company, with rank insignias and dates that told the whole story in shorthand. 2017-2019. Active duty, deployed, the Middle East, though the tattoo didn't specify exactly where. It just said, "You served." It said, "You survived something significant." She'd gotten it 6 months after leaving the service, when the weight of what she'd experienced finally needed a physical form, when she'd realized that she wasn't going to talk about it, wasn't going to write about it, wasn't going to process it through traditional means, and needed something to acknowledge its existence in her life other than the nightmares that came without invitation, other than the panic attacks that showed up at random moments, other than the way certain smells or sounds could transport her back to a place she'd tried so hard to leave behind. Slowly, deliberately, aware that she was about to show someone something she'd hidden for 6 years, Sarah rolled up her sleeve. The tattoo was visible now, crisp and dark and impossible to deny or minimize. It was professional work, done by an artist who specialized in military tattoos and understood the weight of what she was inking onto someone's body. Dr. McKenzie stared at it for a long moment, really looked at it, and his face changed in a way that Sarah didn't expect. The arrogance melted away like snow in spring, replaced by something Sarah recognized immediately: understanding. Real understanding. And behind that understanding, shame. "You were military," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a realization, a moment of genuine comprehension that arrived like a wave crashing onto shore. "Military police," Sarah confirmed, her voice steady now in a way it hadn't been all night. 2 years. Started in 2017, deployed to the Middle East. Mostly bases and convoy work, security details, that kind of thing. Some other things that I don't talk about much. Dr. McKenzie sat down heavily on the break room chair, like his legs had suddenly stopped supporting his weight, like understanding what the tattoo represented had physically exhausted him. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of frustration mixed with recognition. "Your hands weren't shaking because you're nervous or unstable," he said slowly, working through the realization as he spoke it aloud. "They were shaking because you were back there tonight, in that trauma bay. Those patients screaming, the rush, the adrenaline, the chaos. It probably triggered something. It probably brought back memories, or muscle memory, or whatever it is that your body does when it's been trained for emergency situations, and then finds itself in an emergency situation." Sarah didn't respond immediately. There was nothing to say that wouldn't open doors she'd worked 6 years to carefully close and lock. There was nothing to say that wouldn't require her to articulate experiences that she'd deliberately kept compartmentalized. Memories that she'd trained herself not to think about unless they forced themselves to the surface uninvited. "I'm sorry," Dr. McKenzie said finally, and the apology sounded genuine in a way that surprised her. There was no false contrition, no performative regret. This was real. This was the sound of someone actually confronting their own mistakes. "I'm so sorry. I've been working for 14 hours straight. I'm tired. I'm cranky. My feet hurt, and my brain is operating on fumes. And I made assumptions about you without having any context, without asking any questions, without taking 30 seconds to think about what might actually be going on. The traveling student made a comment about your hands, and instead of asking if you were okay, instead of understanding that maybe there was something deeper going on, that maybe there was a reason for what we were observing, I made you feel small. I made you feel questioned and judged when you were dealing with..." He gestured vaguely at her wrist. "Whatever ghost that tattoo represents. Whatever experiences you went through that were significant enough to mark your body with them permanently." Sarah felt something crack open in her chest. She hadn't expected this. In her experience, people didn't usually respond this way when confronted with evidence of their own mistakes. She hadn't expected this arrogant, Harvard-educated chief resident to sit down and acknowledge his mistake so completely, to articulate exactly what he'd done wrong, and why it was wrong. She hadn't expected the profound relief that came with someone actually seeing her, actually understanding that what they were interpreting as nervousness was something much deeper, something that came with the territory of having lived a certain kind of life, of having been shaped by experiences that didn't just go away because you changed your zip code. "It happens," she said finally, though even as she said it, she knew it wasn't really true. These things happened, yes, but they didn't have to happen. People could choose to ask questions instead of making assumptions. People could choose to extend grace instead of judgment. I should have told you about my military background. I should have made it clear when I was hired that I might have certain triggers. I should have let someone know that certain situations might affect me differently than they affect people who haven't been through what I've been through. "No," Dr. McKenzie said firmly, shaking his head. "No, you shouldn't have had to do any of that. You shouldn't have had to disclose your personal history just to avoid being judged by people who aren't operating with complete information. You performed flawlessly tonight. Every procedure you did was textbook perfect. That central line you placed was exactly where it needed to be. Positioned exactly right. Done with the kind of precision that takes skill and experience. The only thing that was happening was that your body was processing trauma, was responding to triggers, was dealing with something that most people in this hospital don't have to deal with. And instead of recognizing that as a sign of someone dealing with something profound, something significant, I treated you like you were incompetent. That was my failure, not yours." The conversation lasted another 30 minutes, and by the end of it, Dr. McKenzie had apologized 4 separate times, each apology more genuine than the last. He'd also revealed that his father was a veteran, a Navy pilot who'd flown combat missions during the First Gulf War, and that his father had taught him years ago to never, ever underestimate what a person was carrying just by looking at the surface. He talked about conversations he'd had with his father about readjustment, about the difficulty of leaving a life of purpose and structure, and returning to a civilian world that moved at a different pace, that had different expectations, that didn't always understand what military service meant. "My dad struggled with it," Dr. McKenzie said. "For years after he left the Navy, he struggled. He never talked about it much, but I could see it in him. The way certain things would affect him differently than they affected other people. The way he had to work to stay present sometimes. And my mom told me later that he finally found a therapist who understood military service, who'd been military himself, and that made all the difference. Not just in how he healed, but in how he was able to understand his own experiences, to put them into context, to realize that what he was feeling wasn't weakness or instability, but a normal human response to abnormal circumstances. When Sarah left the break room, something had shifted in the hospital's ecosystem, though she didn't fully understand the magnitude of that shift yet. She finished her shift with her head held higher than it had been at any point during the night. The tremors in her hands gradually settled as the hours moved toward dawn, as her nervous system began to recognize that the emergency had passed, that she was safe, that the crisis had resolved. By the time her shift ended at 7 a.m. and she clocked out, she felt something unfamiliar spreading through her chest. Seen. Understood. Not pitied. Not patronized. Not treated as someone with a problem, but genuinely understood by someone who had made a mistake and had the grace and the humility to acknowledge it fully. But the story didn't end there in the break room. It didn't conclude with that conversation and then fade away into the background. Instead, it evolved into something much larger than either of them could have anticipated. Dr. Brandon McKenzie became, unexpectedly and in ways that surprised even him, one of Sarah's strongest allies in the ER. He made a point of learning about the other veterans working at St. Catherine's, and there were more than he'd initially realized. A nursing assistant who'd served in the Navy as a hospital corpsman, a respiratory therapist who'd been in the Air Force working in medical logistics, a hospital chaplain who'd been a Marine and served as a medic, a phlebotomist who'd been Army medical personnel. Without making a big production of it, without announcing a new initiative, or forming an official committee with meetings and agendas and bureaucratic overhead, Dr. McKenzie quietly began to create a space where these individuals felt acknowledged, valued, and understood. He learned about veterans' resources. He studied PTSD and trauma responses. He familiarized himself with the particular challenges of transitioning from military service to civilian work, from an environment where service and sacrifice were central values to an environment where those things were often invisible or underappreciated. 3 months after that night, after Sarah had settled back into her routine and had started to think that maybe things would just return to normal, Dr. McKenzie pulled her aside again. This time it wasn't in the break room. It was in his office, a space that was becoming increasingly cluttered with papers and files as he worked on something that was clearly consuming his attention and energy. He'd spread out papers related to a proposal he was working on, research articles about PTSD, information about support groups, documentation about hospital protocols for mental health resources. "I want to start a program," he said without preamble, getting right to the point in a way that suggested this idea had been percolating in his mind for weeks. "Here at St. Catherine's, a support group for healthcare workers with military backgrounds. We have therapists on staff who specialize in trauma. We have people who work here who get it, who understand what it means to serve, to be changed by service, to come back to a civilian world that doesn't quite understand. I think we could do some real good if we actually formalized this, made it official, gave people a space to talk about what they've experienced without having to do it alone, without having to hide it or pretend it doesn't exist." Sarah was shocked. This was a huge undertaking. This was the kind of thing that required institutional support, administrative buy-in, funding, ongoing coordination. This wasn't something you just decided to do on a whim. "That's a massive undertaking," she said, her mind already running through all the logistics and complications. "How would you even get approval for something like that?" "I've already started the conversations," he said. "I talked to the chief of medicine. I talked to the hospital's director of mental health services. I talked to the compliance department about making sure we're doing this by the book, following all the proper protocols. And everyone I've talked to has been supportive. The hospital has been looking for ways to support mental health, to create a more comprehensive approach to wellness for staff. This fits perfectly into that framework." "Okay," Sarah said slowly, beginning to see the outline of what he was trying to build. "Okay, so you're serious about this." "Completely serious," he said. "And I want you to help me run it. Not as staff, not in an official capacity, but as someone who actually lived it. Someone who actually understands what it's like to leave that world and try to fit into this one. Someone who understands what it's like to have your hands shake and not know how to explain why to people who've never been there." Sarah agreed. And over the next 6 months, they built the program from the ground up together, working in the spaces between their regular jobs, staying late after shifts, using their lunch breaks to have meetings with hospital administrators and therapists and other people who had resources and expertise to contribute. They met with hospital administration, secured funding through a combination of departmental budgets and grants, trained facilitators who could lead groups with sensitivity and understanding. They created a space, literally, They converted an unused office into a comfortable space with real furniture instead of hard chairs, with soft lighting instead of harsh fluorescence, with plants and art that made it feel more like a living room than a medical facility. The first support group meeting had 6 attendees, people who'd taken a risk by showing up, who'd decided that maybe it was worth trying to talk about the things they'd been carrying alone. Sarah led that first meeting, sitting in a circle with these people: a veteran who worked in hospital maintenance, a nurse who'd served in the Air Force, a doctor who'd been in the Army, a therapist's assistant who'd been a Marine, a security guard who'd been Navy, and an administrative assistant who'd been Army intelligence. There was no judgment in that circle. There was only recognition. The second meeting had 9 attendees. Word spread quietly through the hospital's veteran community. People started to feel like they could come. It became safer to talk about the things that happened, the things that persisted after service ended, the ways that military training didn't just go away when you hung up your uniform. Within a year, they were running 2 groups a week. One focused on PTSD and trauma processing, and another focused on the specific challenges of career transition. St. Catherine's had become known in the region as a hospital that understood and actively supported its military healthcare workers. Other hospitals started calling to ask how they'd built it, what the structure looked like, what resources they'd used. Medical journals published articles about the program. Healthcare conferences invited Dr. McKenzie to speak about trauma-informed care and supporting military-connected employees. But the real surprise came about 2 years after that first conversation in the break room, when things had settled into a new normal, and Sarah had almost stopped being amazed by how much had changed. Sarah was working a night shift when a woman came into the ER, accompanied by a man in a military dress uniform, Class A uniform, which meant this was important, which meant this wasn't a casual visit. The woman was in her early 60s, and she was clearly distressed, visibly struggling with emotions that she was trying to contain. The man was trying to comfort her, was placing his hand on her shoulder, but she was shaking, crying, asking for someone specific, asking to speak to people who she'd heard could help. "I need to speak to the chief of surgery," the woman kept saying, her voice wavering with emotion. "I need to tell him that my son would have wanted this. I need him to know what he meant to my family." A nurse recognized the situation and called Sarah over, sensing that she might be the right person to talk to this woman who was clearly carrying something heavy. The woman, it turned out, was the mother of a young man who had been a patient at St. Catherine's 5 years ago, long before Sarah had even worked there. Back before the veteran support group existed, back when the hospital hadn't really been set up to understand the needs of military-connected people. He'd been injured in a training accident, a tragic incident that had resulted in serious injuries. He'd come to St. Catherine's for emergency surgery, and Dr. McKenzie had been the resident who'd treated him, who'd fought to save his life, who'd managed to keep him alive through the immediate crisis. The surgery had saved his life, technically. He'd recovered physically, but he'd never fully recovered from the trauma of the incident. He'd been struggling with PTSD, with depression, with the weight of having come so close to death. He'd come home to a family that didn't quite understand what he was experiencing. He'd tried to go back to his career, but the anxiety had become overwhelming. He'd struggled with substance use, trying to self-medicate the pain that was too much to bear. And 6 months after his discharge from St. Catherine's, he'd taken his own life. The woman wanted to donate money in her son's name. More than that, She wanted to create an official fund to support the PTSD and trauma recovery of military-connected healthcare workers, to make sure that other people didn't suffer the way her son had suffered, to make sure that there were resources available, that there were people who understood, that people didn't have to suffer alone. "My son was going to be a nurse," she told Sarah through tears, her voice breaking with the weight of grief that had clearly not diminished with time. "He loved helping people. That's why he joined the military. He wanted to serve. He wanted to be the kind of person who made a difference in people's lives. And when he came back, he was struggling. He was having nightmares, panic attacks, all of it. He couldn't sleep. He would wake up screaming. He would have episodes where he couldn't tell where he was or when he was. He needed help. Real help. Professional help. And if there had been a program like what I'm hearing you're doing here, a program where people understood what he was going through, a program where he could talk to people who'd been through similar things, a program where he wouldn't feel so alone, maybe he would have known how to get help. Maybe he wouldn't have... She didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. Maybe he wouldn't have decided that death was better than continuing to live with what he was experiencing. The fund was established. The mother donated substantially to get it started. And then she reached out to other families of veterans who'd lost loved ones to suicide or to the complications of PTSD. Within a year, they'd raised enough money to endow a position for a full-time mental health counselor dedicated to working with military personnel and military-connected healthcare workers. Dr. McKenzie was invited to speak at the dedication ceremony for the fund. Sarah gave a speech about what it meant to have people who understood, to have a space where you didn't have to hide who you were or pretend that your past didn't affect you. She talked about shaking hands and how they don't mean weakness, how they mean you've survived something, how they're a sign of strength, not fragility, how asking someone to show you their scars can change everything, can transform not just one person's life but an entire community's approach to understanding and supporting people who've been through significant experiences. 3 years after that first night in the trauma bay, Sarah was promoted. She became the full-time coordinator of the Veterans in Healthcare program at St. Catherine's, a position that had been created specifically for her, that involved counseling, resource coordination, training for other staff members about trauma-informed care, community outreach to other hospitals and organizations, and advocacy for policies that would support military-connected healthcare workers. Dr. McKenzie had moved on from being a resident to becoming chief of the emergency department, and one of his first acts in that position was to ensure that the Veterans Program had permanent funding, institutional support, and integration into the hospital's core mission statement. But the real gift came on a day when Sarah wasn't expecting anything particularly significant. Just a regular Tuesday morning, when she was giving a tour of the program to a group of hospital administrators who were visiting from other healthcare systems to learn about what St. Catherine's had built. She was showing them the new meditation room they'd decorated with nature photography, images of mountains, and forests and peaceful water scenes chosen, specifically because many veterans responded well to natural imagery. She was showing them the resource library they'd stocked with books and pamphlets and DVDs about PTSD and recovery, about the neurobiology of trauma, about recovery and healing. She was showing them the comfortable seating area where people could talk without the clinical harshness of the ER or the sterile coldness of an office. She was explaining the structure of the support groups, the protocols they'd established, the way they connected people with mental health services and medical care and career support if they needed it. One of the administrators, a man in his 60s who'd been quiet throughout the tour, who'd listened more than he'd asked questions, who'd observed the space carefully, approached her as the group was leaving, as the other visitors were being herded toward the exit by the hospital's director of public relations. "I was military," he said quietly, approaching her in a way that suggested he didn't want the other people to hear this conversation. 23 years in the army, infantry, combat tours. I got out in 1995, and I've never talked about it with anyone at this hospital until today. Watching what you've built here, understanding what this program offers, I'm wondering if maybe I've been carrying something alone that I didn't have to carry alone. I'm wondering if maybe I've been dealing with nightmares and flashbacks and anxiety for 30 years, when there could have been a way to address it, to talk about it, to process it with people who understood.